Question 1. Benchmark analysis indicates that a manufacturing facility generates a mixed waste stream including paper, plastics, food scraps, and non-recyclable packaging. The facility is seeking to optimize its waste management strategy to reduce environmental impact and comply with evolving state regulations. Which of the following approaches best aligns with these objectives? Option A. Investing in advanced incineration technology to reduce the volume of all waste streams, including food scraps and packaging, before any residual material is landfilled. Option B. Implementing a comprehensive program that includes source separation for recycling of paper and plastics, a dedicated composting program for food scraps, and landfilling only residual non-recyclable materials. Option C. Focusing solely on maximizing the recycling of paper and plastics, assuming that the remaining mixed waste will be handled through existing, less optimized disposal methods. Option D. Increasing the frequency of landfill pickups to manage the volume of mixed waste, as this is the most cost-effective immediate solution. The correct answer is B. Implementing a comprehensive program that includes source separation for recycling of paper and plastics, a dedicated composting program for food scraps, and landfilling only residual non-recyclable materials. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an environmental professional intern to balance competing waste management objectives: environmental protection, economic feasibility, and regulatory compliance within a specific operational context. The intern must critically evaluate the effectiveness and appropriateness of different waste management strategies, moving beyond theoretical knowledge to practical application. This demands careful judgment to select the most sustainable and compliant approach. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes waste reduction and diversion through recycling and composting, aligning with the principles of the waste hierarchy. This strategy minimizes the volume of waste sent to landfill, thereby reducing environmental impacts such as leachate generation and greenhouse gas emissions. It also conserves resources by recovering valuable materials. Regulatory frameworks, such as the U.S. Resource Conservation and Recovery Act (RCRA) and state-specific waste management plans, generally encourage or mandate such diversion efforts. Ethically, this approach demonstrates a commitment to environmental stewardship and long-term sustainability. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on landfilling is professionally unacceptable. This fails to adhere to the waste hierarchy, which ranks landfilling as the least preferred option. It directly contravenes the spirit and often the letter of environmental regulations that aim to reduce landfill reliance. Ethically, it represents a failure to act in the best interest of environmental protection and resource conservation. Another incorrect approach that emphasizes only recycling without considering the feasibility of composting for organic waste is also professionally deficient. While recycling is beneficial, neglecting organic waste diversion means a significant portion of the waste stream is still destined for landfill, missing a key opportunity for further waste reduction. This approach may also be inefficient if the recycling infrastructure is not optimized for the specific waste streams generated. Finally, an approach that prioritizes cost savings above all else, potentially leading to the selection of the cheapest but least environmentally sound disposal method, is ethically and regulatorily flawed. Environmental regulations often impose costs associated with proper waste management, and prioritizing cost over compliance or environmental performance is a direct violation of professional duty and legal requirements. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a thorough assessment of the waste stream composition, available diversion technologies and infrastructure, regulatory requirements, federal, state, and local, economic considerations, and long-term environmental goals. The intern should consult relevant environmental legislation, industry best practices, and seek guidance from senior professionals to ensure a well-informed and defensible decision. Question 2. Market research demonstrates that many environmental consulting firms are seeking interns with a broad understanding of environmental challenges. Considering the definition and scope of environmental science, which of the following best describes the foundational knowledge an environmental professional intern should possess to effectively contribute to a project involving a new industrial development? Option A. Expertise solely in the biological impacts of pollution on local flora and fauna, with no emphasis on human or economic factors. Option B. A specialized skill set focused exclusively on the remediation techniques for contaminated soil and water, assuming all other environmental aspects are handled by senior staff. Option C. A comprehensive understanding of how natural systems function, the impact of human activities on these systems, and the social, economic, and policy frameworks that influence environmental management. Option D. A deep knowledge of only the physical and chemical processes involved in industrial emissions and their immediate atmospheric dispersion. The correct answer is C. A comprehensive understanding of how natural systems function, the impact of human activities on these systems, and the social, economic, and policy frameworks that influence environmental management. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for environmental professionals, defining the boundaries of their expertise and responsibilities within a complex regulatory landscape. The intern must discern which aspects of environmental science fall under their purview and which require consultation with specialists or are outside the scope of their current role. Misinterpreting the scope of environmental science can lead to incomplete assessments, non-compliance, and potentially significant environmental harm, all of which carry professional and legal repercussions. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the intern's contributions are both accurate and appropriately situated within the broader environmental management framework. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it aligns with the fundamental definition and scope of environmental science as an interdisciplinary field. Environmental science integrates principles from natural sciences, biology, chemistry, geology, physics, and social sciences, economics, law, policy, ethics, to understand environmental problems and their solutions. An intern's role, while foundational, should encompass understanding these interconnections. This approach acknowledges that environmental issues are rarely confined to a single discipline and require a holistic perspective. Ethically, it promotes thoroughness and accuracy in environmental assessments, ensuring that all relevant factors are considered. Regulatory compliance is inherently linked to this broad understanding, as environmental regulations often address multifaceted issues that span various scientific and social domains. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that narrowly defines environmental science solely as the study of natural systems, excluding human impacts and societal responses, is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a misunderstanding of the interdisciplinary nature of environmental science. Ethically, it risks overlooking critical anthropogenic factors that drive environmental degradation and hinder effective remediation. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing pollution control or resource management, frequently mandate consideration of socio-economic impacts and public engagement, which this narrow view would ignore. Another incorrect approach, which limits environmental science to only the physical and chemical aspects of pollution, is also professionally flawed. While crucial, this perspective omits biological impacts, e.g., ecosystem health, biodiversity loss, and the human dimensions of environmental problems, e.g., environmental justice, public health. This selective focus can lead to incomplete risk assessments and the development of inadequate mitigation strategies, potentially violating regulations that require comprehensive environmental impact assessments. Finally, an approach that considers environmental science as exclusively focused on remediation and cleanup, neglecting the preventative aspects like impact assessment and sustainable development, is professionally deficient. Environmental science encompasses a proactive as well as a reactive role. Focusing only on remediation overlooks the ethical imperative to prevent environmental damage in the first place, and can lead to regulatory noncompliance, with statutes promoting pollution prevention and sustainable practices. Professional reasoning. Environmental professionals should adopt a decision-making process that begins with a clear understanding of the definition and scope of environmental science as an interdisciplinary field. When faced with a task, they should first identify the core environmental issue. Then, they must consider which scientific disciplines, natural and social, are relevant to understanding the issue and its potential impacts. This should be followed by an assessment of the applicable regulatory framework, noting how it addresses the various facets of the environmental problem. If the scope of the problem extends beyond the professional's immediate expertise or the intern's defined role, the next step is to identify the need for consultation with specialists or to escalate the matter appropriately. This systematic approach ensures that all relevant dimensions of an environmental challenge are considered, leading to more effective, compliant, and ethically sound outcomes. Question 3. Governance review demonstrates that a series of proposed infrastructure projects require careful evaluation for their alignment with the principles of sustainable development. An environmental professional intern is tasked with assessing these proposals. Which of the following evaluation approaches best reflects a comprehensive understanding of sustainable development principles within the context of regulatory compliance and ethical practice? Option A. Prioritizing projects that offer the greatest immediate economic return while ensuring basic environmental compliance is met. Option B. Conducting a thorough assessment that integrates environmental impact, social equity, and economic viability for each project, seeking a balance that promotes long-term well-being. Option C. Focusing exclusively on projects that demonstrate the most significant reduction in immediate environmental pollution, regardless of other impacts. Option D. Evaluating projects based on their potential to generate social benefits and community engagement, without detailed consideration of economic feasibility or environmental limits. The correct answer is A. Prioritizing projects that offer the greatest immediate economic return, while ensuring basic environmental compliance is met. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an environmental professional intern to balance competing interests inherent in sustainable development. The intern must evaluate different project proposals, each with varying environmental, social, and economic implications. The challenge lies in moving beyond a purely environmental focus to integrate the broader principles of sustainability, which often involve trade-offs and require a nuanced understanding of long-term impacts versus immediate gains. The intern must also consider the specific regulatory framework governing environmental professionals in their jurisdiction, ensuring that any recommendation aligns with legal requirements and ethical standards. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive assessment that explicitly considers the three pillars of sustainable development: environmental protection, social equity, and economic viability. This aligns with the foundational principles of sustainable development as espoused by international frameworks and often reflected in national environmental legislation and professional codes of conduct. A professional in this role is expected to analyze how each project proposal impacts natural resources, biodiversity, community well-being, and local economies. The chosen approach prioritizes long-term resilience and intergenerational equity, ensuring that development decisions do not compromise the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. This holistic evaluation is crucial for making informed recommendations that genuinely contribute to sustainable outcomes, rather than merely addressing immediate environmental concerns. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that solely focuses on minimizing immediate environmental pollution without considering the social or economic consequences fails to embrace the integrated nature of sustainable development. This narrow focus can lead to projects that are environmentally sound in the short term but may create social displacement or economic hardship, thus undermining overall sustainability. Ethically, it neglects the social and economic dimensions that are integral to responsible development. Another incorrect approach might prioritize economic benefits above all else, viewing environmental and social considerations as secondary or as mere compliance hurdles. This approach directly contradicts the core tenets of sustainable development, which mandate the integration of all three pillars. Such a decision-making process risks irreversible environmental damage and social inequity, leading to long-term costs that outweigh short-term economic gains. It also likely violates regulatory requirements that mandate environmental impact assessments and consideration of social factors. An approach that exclusively emphasizes social benefits without adequate consideration of environmental carrying capacity or economic feasibility is also flawed. While social equity is a vital component of sustainability, development projects must be environmentally sound and economically viable to be truly sustainable in the long run. Ignoring these aspects can lead to projects that are unsustainable due to resource depletion or financial insolvency, ultimately failing to deliver lasting social benefits. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of the specific regulatory framework and the principles of sustainable development as defined within that jurisdiction. This involves 1. Identifying all relevant stakeholders and their interests. 2. conducting a multi-criteria analysis that systematically evaluates each project proposal against environmental, social, and economic indicators. 3. Assessing the long-term implications and potential trade-offs associated with each option. 4. Seeking expert advice where necessary to ensure a comprehensive understanding of complex issues. 5. Formulating recommendations that demonstrate a balanced integration of the three pillars of sustainable development, supported by robust evidence, and aligned with regulatory requirements and ethical obligations. Question 4. Consider a scenario where an environmental professional intern is tasked with assessing potential soil and water contamination across a large, previously undeveloped tract of land slated for commercial development. The project has a limited budget for environmental investigations, and the intern must propose an initial monitoring strategy to identify areas of potential concern for further, more detailed investigation. The intern has access to both aerial imagery of the site and the ability to conduct limited on-site soil and water sampling. Which of the following approaches best balances efficiency, cost-effectiveness, and the need for preliminary data to inform regulatory compliance and subsequent detailed investigations? Option A. Propose the deployment of advanced, multispectral remote sensing technology to map subsurface geological formations, and then conduct limited, opportunistic field sampling based on the geological interpretations. Option B. Utilize readily available aerial imagery to gain a general understanding of the site's topography and land cover, identifying obvious features like water bodies or distressed vegetation, and then conduct targeted field sampling in these areas of potential concern. Option C. Immediately initiate widespread, systematic grid-based soil and water sampling across the entire property to ensure comprehensive coverage, without utilizing any remote sensing data. Option D. Conduct extensive, high-resolution remote sensing analysis of the entire site to identify subtle anomalies, and then proceed with targeted field sampling only in areas flagged by the remote sensing. The correct answer is D. Conduct extensive, high-resolution remote sensing analysis of the entire site to identify subtle anomalies, and then proceed with targeted field sampling only in areas flagged by the remote sensing. Explanation: Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for environmental professional interns, selecting the most appropriate environmental monitoring technique when faced with resource constraints and the need for comprehensive data. The professional challenge lies in balancing the desire for detailed, ground-truthed information with the practical limitations of time, budget, and personnel. Furthermore, the intern must consider the specific regulatory requirements for the project, ensuring that the chosen method will yield data that is legally defensible and sufficient for compliance purposes. The need for accurate and reliable data to inform environmental decision-making adds another layer of complexity, as incorrect monitoring can lead to misinterpretations of environmental conditions, potentially resulting in non-compliance, ineffective remediation, or unnecessary costs. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a phased strategy that leverages the strengths of both remote sensing and field sampling. Initially, remote sensing, such as aerial photography or satellite imagery, can provide a broad overview of the site and surrounding area, identifying potential areas of concern, mapping land cover, and detecting large-scale anomalies. This initial assessment helps to efficiently allocate limited field resources to the most critical areas. Following this, targeted field sampling, using appropriate techniques like soil borings, water sampling, or air quality monitoring, provides the detailed ground truth data necessary to confirm or refute the observations from remote sensing, quantify contaminant levels, and meet specific regulatory reporting requirements. This integrated approach is best professional practice because it is cost-effective, maximizes the utility of available data, and ensures that regulatory objectives are met with a high degree of confidence. It aligns with the principles of sound environmental management by employing a systematic and data-driven methodology. Incorrect approaches analysis. Relying solely on remote sensing without any field validation is professionally unacceptable because remote sensing data, while valuable for broad-scale assessment, can be subject to interpretation errors, atmospheric interference, and may not provide the specific quantitative data required by regulations. For example, identifying a discolored area from imagery does not confirm the presence or concentration of a specific pollutant without ground truthing. This failure to collect legally defensible, quantitative data would likely lead to regulatory noncompliance. Using only field sampling without any initial remote sensing assessment is also professionally suboptimal, especially in large or complex sites. While field sampling provides precise data, it can be inefficient and costly if not strategically directed. Without an initial overview from remote sensing, field teams might expend significant resources investigating areas that ultimately prove to be of low environmental concern, potentially delaying the identification of critical issues and exceeding budget limitations. This inefficiency can indirectly impact regulatory compliance by delaying necessary actions. Implementing a highly advanced and expensive remote sensing technique that is not mandated by regulations and does not provide data beyond what is achievable with simpler, more cost-effective methods, while also neglecting essential field sampling, represents a failure in professional judgment and resource management. This approach wastes financial resources that could have been better utilized for essential field validation or other project needs, and it fails to provide the necessary ground truth data for regulatory acceptance. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach environmental monitoring by first understanding the project objectives and regulatory requirements. This involves identifying what specific environmental parameters need to be measured and to what degree of accuracy. Next, they should consider the site characteristics and potential environmental concerns to determine the most efficient and effective monitoring strategies. A phased approach, starting with broader-scale techniques like remote sensing to identify areas of interest, followed by targeted field sampling for detailed data collection and validation, is generally the most prudent. This iterative process allows for adaptive management of monitoring efforts, ensuring that resources are used wisely and that the data collected is both scientifically sound and regulatorily compliant. Professionals must always prioritize data quality, defensibility, and cost-effectiveness in their decision-making. Question 5. The investigation demonstrates that a proposed infrastructure development project is located adjacent to a known wetland area supporting diverse amphibian populations and a rare plant species. The project aims to expand industrial capacity, which will necessitate some land clearing and alteration of drainage patterns in the vicinity of the wetland. The environmental professional intern is tasked with evaluating the ecological implications and recommending a course of action. Which of the following approaches best reflects the application of ecological principles and best professional practice in this scenario? Option A. Rely on general knowledge of wetland ecology and past project experiences to recommend minimal disturbance, without undertaking detailed field investigations or impact modeling for this specific site. Option B. Immediately proceed with land clearing and drainage alteration, as the economic benefits of industrial expansion outweigh potential minor ecological disturbances. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive ecological impact assessment, focusing on identifying critical habitats, species of concern, and hydrological connections, followed by the development of site-specific mitigation strategies to minimize or compensate for unavoidable impacts. Option D. Implement generic wetland mitigation measures, such as creating a small buffer zone, without detailed site-specific surveys, assuming this will adequately protect the existing ecosystem. The correct answer is B. Immediately proceed with land clearing and drainage alteration, as the economic benefits of industrial expansion outweigh potential minor ecological disturbances. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an environmental professional intern to apply ecological principles to a real-world situation involving potential habitat disruption. The intern must balance the need for development with the imperative to protect sensitive ecosystems, a common tension in environmental practice. Accurate assessment of ecological impacts and the selection of appropriate mitigation strategies are critical to avoid regulatory noncompliance and ecological damage. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing the preservation of ecological integrity through a phased assessment and mitigation strategy. This aligns with the precautionary principle often embedded in environmental regulations, which advocates for taking preventive action in the face of uncertainty. By first identifying and characterizing the sensitive ecological features, then assessing potential impacts, and finally developing targeted mitigation measures, The intern is systematically addressing the ecological risks. This methodical approach ensures that decisions are data-driven and informed by an understanding of ecological processes, thereby minimizing harm and fulfilling regulatory obligations to protect biodiversity and ecosystem functions. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach fails by prioritizing immediate development without adequate ecological assessment. This disregards the fundamental ecological principle of understanding baseline conditions before initiating activities that could cause irreversible harm. Ethically and regulatorily, this is unacceptable as it bypasses due diligence requirements and the responsibility to protect the environment. Another incorrect approach is to implement generic mitigation measures without a specific understanding of the site's ecological context. This is flawed because ecological systems are unique, and mitigation strategies must be tailored to the specific species, habitats, and ecological processes present. A one-size-fits-all approach is unlikely to be effective and may lead to regulatory noncompliance and continued ecological degradation. A further incorrect approach involves relying solely on anecdotal evidence or past experience without current, site-specific ecological data. While experience is valuable, ecological conditions can change, and specific site characteristics are paramount. This approach risks making decisions based on outdated or irrelevant information, leading to inadequate impact assessment and ineffective mitigation, which is a failure of professional responsibility and regulatory adherence. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic, science-based approach. This involves 1. Clearly defining the project's scope and potential interactions with the environment. 2. Conducting thorough baseline ecological surveys to understand existing conditions, including sensitive habitats and species. 3. Performing a robust impact assessment, evaluating the magnitude, duration, and significance of potential effects. 4. Developing and evaluating a range of mitigation and enhancement options, prioritizing avoidance and minimization. 5. Implementing and monitoring the chosen mitigation measures to ensure their effectiveness. This process ensures compliance with environmental laws and ethical obligations to protect ecological resources. Question 6. Upon reviewing preliminary soil sampling results for a site undergoing environmental assessment, an environmental professional intern notices a few data points that are significantly higher than the rest, suggesting potential localized contamination. However, the majority of the data points indicate levels well within acceptable regulatory limits. The intern supervisor suggests focusing the final report on the average of all data, which would present a generally positive environmental picture, and downplaying the anomalous high readings as likely outliers without further investigation. What is the most ethically and professionally sound approach for the intern to take regarding the data collection and analysis methods in this situation? Option A. Proceed with reporting the average of all collected data, including the anomalous high readings, without further investigation, assuming they are statistically insignificant and do not warrant detailed discussion in the report. Option B. Document all collected data, including the anomalous high readings, investigate the cause of these anomalies through appropriate quality control measures and potentially further sampling, and report all findings transparently, including statistical analysis of the entire dataset and any identified localized contamination. Option C. Focus the report on the majority of data points that fall within acceptable limits, and briefly mention the anomalous high readings as potential data entry errors that were not reproducible. Option D. Exclude the anomalous high data points from the final analysis and report, as they appear to be outliers and do not represent the overall site conditions, thereby presenting a more favorable and representative environmental picture. The correct answer is B. Document all collected data, including the anomalous high readings, investigate the cause of these anomalies through appropriate quality control measures and potentially further sampling, and report all findings transparently, including statistical analysis of the entire dataset and any identified localized contamination. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it involves a conflict between the desire to present a positive outcome and the ethical obligation to report data accurately, even if it is unfavorable. As an environmental professional intern, you are expected to uphold scientific integrity and adhere to regulatory requirements for data reporting. The pressure to manipulate or selectively report data, even if seemingly minor, can lead to significant ethical breaches and regulatory noncompliance. The intern must navigate this pressure by prioritizing accurate data collection and analysis methods, understanding that the integrity of environmental assessments relies on unbiased and complete information. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves transparently documenting all collected data, including any anomalies or deviations from expected results, and employing appropriate statistical methods to analyze the entire dataset. This aligns with best professional practices as outlined in environmental regulations and professional codes of conduct, which mandate honest and accurate reporting. For instance, under U.S. EPA guidelines, data integrity is paramount, and any deviation from standard operating procedures or analytical methods must be thoroughly documented and justified. Employing robust statistical analysis ensures that conclusions drawn are scientifically sound and defensible, providing a true representation of environmental conditions. This approach upholds the intern's professional responsibility to provide objective information for decision-making. Incorrect approaches analysis, selecting only the data that supports a favorable conclusion while omitting unfavorable results, constitutes data manipulation and misrepresentation. This is a direct violation of ethical principles and regulatory requirements for data integrity. In the U.S., this could be considered a violation of the Toxic Substances Control Act, TSCA, or Clean Water Act, CWA, reporting requirements, which demand truthful and complete submissions. Such an action undermines the credibility of the environmental assessment and can lead to incorrect environmental management decisions, potentially causing harm. Failing to investigate or document anomalies in the collected data and proceeding with analysis as if they did not exist demonstrates a lack of due diligence and adherence to proper scientific methodology. Environmental regulations often require thorough investigation of unexpected results. Ignoring anomalies can lead to a skewed understanding of the environmental conditions, masking potential risks or noncompliance. This approach fails to meet the standards of professional practice and could violate reporting obligations under various environmental statutes. Presenting preliminary or incomplete data as final results without proper qualification or explanation is misleading. Environmental data collection and analysis often involve iterative processes and quality control checks. Submitting incomplete data can create a false sense of certainty and lead to premature or incorrect conclusions. This practice is ethically questionable and can contravene regulatory requirements for comprehensive environmental reporting. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach data collection and analysis with a commitment to objectivity and transparency. When faced with potentially unfavorable data or anomalies, the decision-making process should involve 1. Thoroughly documenting all collected data, including any deviations or unexpected results. 2. Investigating the cause of any anomalies through appropriate quality control measures and further sampling if necessary. 3. Applying statistically sound analytical methods to the complete and validated dataset. 4. Clearly communicating all findings, including limitations or uncertainties, in the final report. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are based on accurate, complete, and scientifically defensible information, upholding professional integrity and regulatory compliance. Question 7. Market research demonstrates a growing emphasis on corporate disclosure of climate change-related environmental impacts. An environmental professional intern is tasked with preparing a report for their company, which operates a manufacturing facility. The intern needs to identify and report on the facility's significant environmental impacts directly attributable to climate change, as required by specify a relevant U.S. federal environmental regulation, e.g., the EPA's Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program or a state-level climate disclosure mandate. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory compliance and professional best practices for this reporting task? Option A. Compile a general overview of global climate change trends and their potential future consequences for the industry, without specific quantification of the facility's current impacts. Option B. Focus on the company's investments in renewable energy and carbon offsetting projects, assuming these actions inherently mitigate all potential environmental impacts related to climate change. Option C. Quantify direct greenhouse gas emissions from the facility's operations using EPA-approved methodologies and assess potential impacts on local water resources and air quality based on established climate projection models for the region. Option D. Rely on anecdotal reports from local community members regarding perceived changes in weather patterns and their potential link to the facility's operations, without conducting independent scientific analysis. The correct answer is C. Quantify direct greenhouse gas emissions from the facility's operations using EPA-approved methodologies and assess potential impacts on local water resources and air quality based on established climate projection models for the region. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an environmental professional intern to navigate the complexities of climate change reporting and its potential environmental impacts within a specific regulatory framework, without resorting to speculative or unsubstantiated claims. The intern must demonstrate a thorough understanding of the applicable regulations and the scientific basis for assessing environmental impacts. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the regulatory requirement for reporting environmental impacts related to climate change. It emphasizes the use of established methodologies and data sources, aligning with the principles of due diligence and scientific integrity expected of environmental professionals. This approach ensures that the reporting is accurate, defensible, and compliant with the relevant environmental laws and guidelines. An incorrect approach that relies solely on anecdotal evidence or unverified projections fails to meet regulatory standards. Such an approach would be professionally unacceptable due to its lack of empirical support and potential to mislead stakeholders. It violates the ethical obligation to provide accurate and objective information. Another incorrect approach that focuses on general climate change mitigation strategies without a direct link to the specific environmental impacts of the company's operations would also be deficient. This would fail to address the core regulatory requirement of assessing and reporting on the company's direct environmental footprint. A third incorrect approach that prioritizes cost saving over thorough impact assessment would be a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This demonstrates a disregard for environmental protection and compliance, potentially leading to legal repercussions and reputational damage. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the regulatory objectives. This involves identifying the specific reporting requirements related to climate change and environmental impacts. Next, professionals should gather relevant data using credible sources and established methodologies. They should then analyze this data to identify potential environmental impacts, ensuring that the analysis is objective and scientifically sound. Finally, the findings should be communicated in a clear, concise, and compliant manner, adhering to all regulatory guidelines. Question 8. Examination of the data shows a slight upward trend in dissolved oxygen levels in the receiving water body downstream of permitted industrial discharge over the past 6 months, with several readings approaching, but not exceeding, the lower limit of the acceptable range defined in the facility's National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, NPDES, permit. Concurrently, there has been a minor increase in turbidity, also within permit limits, and a slight decrease in the population of a sensitive benthic invertebrate species previously identified as an indicator organism in the facility's environmental monitoring plan. Which of the following represents the most appropriate professional response to this data? Option A. Immediately recommend a significant upgrade to the facility's wastewater treatment system to address the perceived negative environmental impacts. Option B. Recommend a focused investigation into potential synergistic effects between the increased turbidity and the dissolved oxygen trend, and assess the implications for the indicator species, while continuing routine monitoring to track the trends. Option C. Conclude that all parameters are within permit limits and no further action is required beyond standard reporting. Option D. Attribute the observed changes solely to natural seasonal variations and recommend no changes to the current monitoring or operational protocols. The correct answer is B. Recommend a focused investigation into potential synergistic effects between the increased turbidity and the dissolved oxygen trend, and assess the implications for the indicator species, while continuing routine monitoring to track the trends. Explanation: this scenario presents a common challenge in environmental professional practice, interpreting complex monitoring data to inform regulatory compliance and risk assessment. The professional challenge lies in discerning the significance of subtle trends and potential anomalies against established regulatory thresholds, and the inherent variability of environmental systems. A key aspect is understanding the limitations of the monitoring program itself and the potential for confounding factors. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a systematic, data-driven, and contextually aware interpretation. It involves comparing the observed data against relevant regulatory standards, e.g., EPA guidelines for water quality parameters, state-specific air emission limits, and considering the project's specific environmental impact assessment, IA, commitments. This approach ensures that decisions are grounded in scientific evidence and legal requirements, minimizing the risk of non-compliance or inadequate environmental protection. It also acknowledges the need for expert judgment in identifying potential sources of variation and recommending appropriate follow-up actions, such as further investigation or adaptive management strategies. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on individual data points without considering trends or variability fails to meet regulatory expectations for comprehensive environmental monitoring. This can lead to either overreacting to transient fluctuations or, more critically, overlooking developing environmental issues that could lead to long-term degradation and non-compliance. Another incorrect approach that dismisses potential anomalies due to perceived natural variability without proper investigation risks violating the precautionary principle and failing to identify emerging environmental problems. This can result in significant environmental damage and subsequent legal or financial repercussions. A third incorrect approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or assumptions rather than rigorous data analysis undermines the scientific integrity of the environmental assessment process and is contrary to professional ethical standards and regulatory requirements for objective reporting. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with clearly defining the monitoring objectives and relevant regulatory requirements. This is followed by a thorough data validation process, statistical analysis to identify trends and significant deviations, and comparison against established benchmarks. Crucially, this framework includes a critical evaluation of potential sources of error or variability and the development of a tiered response plan for addressing deviations, ranging from further investigation to immediate corrective actions. Expert consultation and peer review are also vital components of this process to ensure robust and defensible conclusions. Question 9. Performance analysis shows that a proposed industrial development project has the potential to impact local water resources and biodiversity. As an environmental professional intern, which approach would best ensure the project aligns with sustainable development principles and resource management guidelines? Option A. Focus on immediate compliance with the minimum regulatory requirements, without proactively investigating potential long-term environmental consequences or exploring opportunities for enhanced resource efficiency. Option B. Rely on the developer's preliminary environmental statements and personal judgment to determine the project's sustainability, without conducting an independent, in-depth risk analysis. Option C. Prioritize the economic benefits of the development, assuming that any environmental impacts will be minor and manageable through standard operational procedures without extensive upfront assessment. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive environmental risk assessment to identify potential impacts, evaluate their significance, and propose appropriate mitigation and management strategies, ensuring alignment with relevant environmental regulations and best practices for resource conservation. Correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive environmental risk assessment to identify potential impacts, evaluate their significance, and propose appropriate mitigation and management strategies, ensuring alignment with relevant environmental regulations and best practices for resource conservation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because an environmental professional intern is tasked with evaluating the sustainability of a proposed development project. The challenge lies in balancing economic development with environmental protection and resource conservation, a core tenet of sustainable development. The intern must apply a risk assessment framework to identify potential negative impacts and propose mitigation strategies that align with regulatory requirements and ethical considerations. The intern's judgment is critical in ensuring the project's long-term viability and minimizing its ecological footprint. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it systematically identifies potential environmental risks associated with the project and quantifies their likelihood and severity. This allows for informed decision-making regarding mitigation measures and the overall feasibility of the project from a sustainability perspective. Adhering to established risk assessment methodologies ensures that all significant environmental aspects are considered, aligning with the principles of responsible environmental management and the precautionary principle often embedded in environmental regulations. This approach also facilitates transparent communication with stakeholders and regulatory bodies by providing a data-driven basis for recommendations. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate economic benefits without a thorough environmental risk assessment fails to uphold the principles of sustainable development. This approach is ethically flawed as it prioritizes short-term gains over long-term environmental health and resource availability, potentially leading to irreversible ecological damage and future remediation costs. It also represents a regulatory failure by neglecting to adequately consider environmental impact assessment requirements, which are designed to prevent or minimize harm. Another incorrect approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or personal opinion rather than a structured risk assessment is professionally unsound. This method lacks objectivity and rigor, making it difficult to justify decisions or defend them against scrutiny. It also fails to meet the professional standard of evidence-based practice, which is crucial for credible environmental consulting. Ethically, it can lead to biased recommendations that do not serve the best interests of the environment or the public. A third incorrect approach that dismisses potential environmental risks due to a lack of readily available data, without proposing a plan to gather such data or using conservative assumptions, is also professionally deficient. This can result in underestimating the project's environmental impact, leading to unforeseen problems and noncompliance. It represents a failure to proactively manage environmental risks and a disregard for the precautionary principle, which mandates taking preventive action in the face of uncertainty. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Clearly defining the project's scope and objectives. 2. Identifying all potential environmental aspects and impacts. 3. Selecting an appropriate risk assessment methodology. 4. Gathering relevant data or identifying data gaps and planning for their resolution. 5. Analyzing risks, considering likelihood and consequence. 6. Developing and evaluating mitigation and management strategies. 7. Documenting the process and findings. 8. Communicating recommendations clearly and transparently. 9. Ensuring compliance with all applicable regulations and ethical standards. Question 10. Strategic planning requires an environmental professional intern to develop a human health risk assessment for a former industrial site. The intern is considering various approaches to optimize the process. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory requirements and professional best practices for ensuring a scientifically sound and defensible risk assessment? Option A. Prioritize the rapid collection of all available environmental data, then use generalized toxicity benchmarks and simplified exposure models to quickly estimate potential risks, deferring detailed toxicological evaluations to a later stage if significant risks are indicated. Option B. Focus on identifying the most likely exposure pathways and then apply conservative, worst-case exposure scenarios to all identified contaminants, assuming high toxicity for all substances to ensure a precautionary outcome. Option C. Concentrate on the most frequently detected contaminants, using readily available, generic exposure data, and assume that if these contaminants are below established screening levels, the overall risk is negligible without further investigation. Option D. Systematically follow the established risk assessment paradigm, including thorough hazard identification, dose-response assessment using relevant toxicological data, detailed exposure assessment considering all potential pathways and populations, and a comprehensive risk characterization that acknowledges uncertainties. The correct answer is A. Prioritize the rapid collection of all available environmental data, then use generalized toxicity benchmarks and simplified exposure models to quickly estimate potential risks, deferring detailed toxicological evaluations to a later stage if significant risks are indicated. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an environmental professional intern to balance the need for efficient data collection with the ethical and regulatory imperative to accurately characterize potential human health risks. The intern must navigate the complexities of toxicology and risk assessment methodologies, understanding that shortcuts can lead to flawed conclusions, potentially impacting public health and regulatory compliance. The pressure to optimize processes must not compromise the scientific integrity of the risk assessment. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a systematic and scientifically sound methodology for human health risk assessment, directly aligning with regulatory frameworks such as the U.S. EPA's Risk Assessment Guidance for Superfund RAGs or similar state-level regulations. This approach emphasizes the critical steps of hazard identification, dose response assessment, exposure assessment, and risk characterization. By ensuring each step is thoroughly conducted, it upholds the ethical responsibility to protect human health and meets regulatory requirements for defensible risk assessments. This systematic process allows for the identification of uncertainties and the development of appropriate risk management strategies, ensuring that decisions are based on robust scientific evidence. Correct approach is analysis. An approach that focuses solely on streamlining data acquisition without a corresponding emphasis on the scientific rigor of each risk assessment component is ethically and regulatorily flawed. For instance, omitting or inadequately performing the dose-response assessment, which establishes the relationship between exposure levels and adverse health effects, would violate fundamental toxicological principles and regulatory mandates. Similarly, a superficial exposure assessment that fails to consider all relevant exposure pathways and populations would lead to an incomplete and potentially misleading risk characterization. Such an approach would be non-compliant with regulations requiring comprehensive risk evaluations and would represent a failure to exercise due diligence in protecting public health. Another incorrect approach might involve relying on generic toxicity values without considering site-specific conditions or the characteristics of the exposed population, which would be a deviation from best practices and regulatory guidance that calls for tailored assessments. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the relevant regulatory requirements and scientific principles. This involves clearly defining the objectives of the risk assessment, identifying potential hazards, and selecting appropriate methodologies. The process should be iterative, allowing for refinement as new information becomes available. Professionals must critically evaluate the quality and relevance of data, ensuring that assumptions are scientifically justified and clearly documented. Transparency and clear communication of methods, assumptions, and uncertainties are paramount. When faced with process optimization pressures, professionals must advocate for approaches that maintain scientific integrity and regulatory compliance, rather than sacrificing rigor for expediency. Question 11. Analysis of a situation where an environmental professional intern is tasked with using Geographic Information Systems, GIS, to map potential wetland impacts from a proposed development. The intern discovers that the available GIS data for the area has a resolution that may not accurately delineate the precise boundaries of smaller, ephemeral wetlands, potentially leading to an underestimation of the development's footprint on these sensitive areas. The intern's supervisor has indicated a preference for a concise report that highlights minimal impact. What is the most ethically and professionally responsible course of action for the intern? Option A. Clearly document the limitations of the GIS data resolution in the report. Explain the potential for underestimation of wetland impacts, and recommend further on-site investigation or the use of higher-resolution data to confirm boundaries. Option B. Inform the supervisor about the data resolution issue and request guidance on how to proceed, but ultimately defer to the supervisor's decision on how to present the findings, even if it means overlooking the data limitations. Option C. Adjust the GIS data by manually altering wetland boundaries to align with the supervisor's expectation of minimal impact, without explicitly stating this manipulation in the report. Option D. Proceed with the analysis using the existing GIS data, focusing on the clearly identifiable features and omitting any mention of the potential inaccuracies related to smaller wetland to maintain a concise report. The correct answer is A. Clearly document the limitations of the GIS data resolution in the report, explain the potential for underestimation of wetland impacts, and recommend further on-site investigation or the use of high-resolution data to confirm boundaries. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the potential conflict between data integrity, client confidentiality, and the ethical obligation to ensure accurate environmental assessments. The intern is entrusted with sensitive project data that, if misrepresented or incompletely analyzed due to GIS limitations, could lead to flawed environmental management decisions. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the desire to present a comprehensive analysis with the technical realities of GIS data resolution and the ethical imperative of transparency. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes data accuracy and transparency, aligning with the ethical principles of environmental professionals. By acknowledging the limitations of the GIS data and seeking clarification and potential supplementary data, the intern demonstrates a commitment to providing reliable information. This upholds the integrity of the environmental assessment process and ensures that decisions are based on the most accurate and complete information available, thereby adhering to the spirit of regulatory frameworks that demand sound scientific basis for environmental management. An incorrect approach that involves manipulating or omitting data to fit the perceived expectations of the client or supervisor is a significant ethical and regulatory failure. This constitutes misrepresentation of environmental conditions, which can lead to non-compliance with environmental regulations and potentially harmful environmental outcomes. It violates the professional duty of honesty and integrity. Another incorrect approach, which is to proceed with the analysis without addressing the data resolution issues, risks generating inaccurate conclusions. This can lead to improper environmental management strategies, potentially resulting in regulatory violations and environmental damage. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to apply professional judgment in interpreting and utilizing GIS data. A further incorrect approach, such as solely relying on the existing GIS data without any attempt to understand its limitations or seek further information, shows a lack of critical thinking and professional responsibility. Environmental professionals are expected to critically evaluate the data they use and understand its potential implications for their analysis and recommendations. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Identifying the core issue, recognizing the limitations of the available data. 2. Assessing the potential impact, understanding how these limitations could affect the environmental assessment and subsequent decisions. 3. Consulting relevant guidelines and ethical codes, reviewing professional standards for data handling and reporting. 4. Communicating transparently, discussing the limitations with supervisors or clients and proposing solutions. 5. Seeking clarification and supplementary information, actively working to overcome data deficiencies. 6. Documenting all decisions and justifications, maintaining a clear record of the process. Question 12. The performance metrics show a 25% increase in hazardous waste generation over the last quarter, leading to a substantial rise in disposal fees. Your supervisor, under pressure to cut costs, has suggested exploring cheaper, albeit less regulated, disposal contractors. You are aware that some of these contractors have a history of environmental violations. What is the most ethically and professionally responsible course of action? Option A. Implement a simple waste segregation program without investigating the underlying causes of the increase, hoping it will marginally reduce disposal volumes. Option B. Immediately begin soliciting bids from the less regulated disposal contractors to identify the cheapest option, as cost savings are the primary concern. Option C. Conduct a detailed root cause analysis of the waste increase, exploring opportunities for source reduction, process optimization, and material substitution, while also researching compliant and cost-effective disposal options that align with environmental regulations. Option D. Inform your supervisor that the waste increase is a minor issue and that focusing on disposal costs is premature, suggesting they address other budgetary concerns. The correct answer is C. Conduct a detailed root cause analysis of the waste increase, exploring opportunities for source reduction, process optimization, and material substitution, while also researching compliant and cost-effective disposal options that align with environmental regulations. Explanation. The performance metrics show a significant increase in waste generation at a manufacturing facility, directly impacting the company's profitability due to rising disposal costs. As an environmental professional intern, you are tasked with identifying solutions. This scenario is professionally challenging because it pits environmental responsibility against immediate financial pressures. The intern must navigate the ethical imperative to minimize environmental harm with the business reality of cost containment. Careful judgment is required to balance these competing interests and propose sustainable solutions. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, data-driven investigation into the root causes of increased waste. This aligns with the ethical principles of environmental stewardship and professional responsibility to seek the most effective and sustainable solutions. By focusing on source reduction and process optimization, it addresses the problem at its origin, which is often the most environmentally sound and cost-effective long-term strategy. This proactive stance also demonstrates a commitment to continuous improvement and regulatory compliance, anticipating potential future environmental liabilities. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate cost reduction through cheaper, less environmentally sound disposal methods fails to uphold the ethical duty to protect the environment. This approach prioritizes short-term financial gains over long-term environmental health and may violate regulations concerning waste management and disposal standards. Another incorrect approach that involves downplaying the significance of the increased waste to management ignores the professional obligation to report environmental issues accurately and transparently. This can lead to a lack of necessary investment in corrective actions and potentially result in non-compliance. An approach that suggests implementing superficial changes without understanding the underlying causes is also flawed, as it is unlikely to yield lasting environmental benefits and may be a waste of resources, failing to meet the professional standard of diligent problem-solving. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive assessment of the problem, gathering all relevant data. This should be followed by an exploration of potential solutions, evaluating each based on its environmental impact, regulatory compliance, and economic feasibility. Ethical considerations, such as the precautionary principle and the duty to minimize harm, should be integrated into this evaluation. Finally, the chosen solution should be implemented with a plan for ongoing monitoring and evaluation to ensure its effectiveness and to identify further opportunities for improvement. Question 13. The evaluation methodology shows a company is undertaking a carbon footprint assessment. Which of the following approaches best aligns with professional best practices for an environmental professional intern in developing this assessment and identifying reduction strategies? Option A. Prioritize the selection of reduction strategies that are most likely to generate positive public relations, even if they do not represent the most significant environmental improvements. Option B. Focus exclusively on emission reduction opportunities that are inexpensive and easy to implement, without a thorough analysis of all emission sources or their relative impact. Option C. Utilize generalized industry average emission factors for all emission sources to quickly estimate the company's carbon footprint and propose broad reduction initiatives. Option D. Conduct a phased assessment, beginning with a detailed inventory of Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, followed by a systematic evaluation of material Scope 3 categories, and then develop smart reduction targets integrated into operational planning. The correct answer is D. Conduct a phased assessment, beginning with a detailed inventory of Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, followed by a systematic evaluation of material Scope 3 categories, and then develop smart reduction targets integrated into operational planning. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows a company is undertaking a carbon footprint assessment. This scenario is professionally challenging because accurately quantifying greenhouse gas emissions and identifying effective reduction strategies requires a comprehensive understanding of various emission sources, data collection methodologies, and the complex interplay of operational activities with environmental impact. The intern must navigate potential data gaps, uncertainties in emission factors, and the need to align strategies with both regulatory requirements and business objectives. Careful judgment is required to ensure the assessment is robust, credible, and actionable. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a systematic and data-driven methodology aligned with recognized international standards for greenhouse gas accounting. This ensures consistency, comparability, and transparency in the carbon footprint assessment. focusing on Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions first, followed by a phased approach to Scope 3, demonstrates a practical and manageable strategy for a professional intern. Identifying specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound, smart, reduction targets, and integrating these into operational planning ensures that the assessment translates into tangible environmental improvements. This aligns with the ethical responsibility of an environmental professional to provide accurate and effective guidance for environmental stewardship and compliance. An incorrect approach that relies solely on publicly available, generalized industry averages without specific site data is professionally unacceptable. This fails to meet the regulatory expectation for accurate reporting and can lead to misinformed decision-making. It represents a failure to exercise due diligence and a disregard for the principle of providing precise and context-specific environmental advice. Another incorrect approach that focuses only on easily achievable, low-cost reductions without a comprehensive assessment of all significant emission sources is also professionally flawed. This approach neglects the potential for greater environmental benefit and may not address the most impactful areas for reduction, thereby failing to meet the overarching goal of effective carbon footprint management. It can also be seen as a failure to act with professional integrity by providing a potentially incomplete or misleading picture of the company's environmental performance. A further incorrect approach that prioritizes perceived stakeholder expectations over scientific accuracy and regulatory compliance is ethically problematic. While stakeholder engagement is important, environmental assessments must be grounded in sound scientific principles and adhere to established regulatory frameworks. Misrepresenting data or conclusions to satisfy external pressures undermines the credibility of the environmental professional and the assessment itself. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve 1. Clearly defining the scope and objectives of the assessment in consultation with relevant stakeholders. 2. Identifying and applying appropriate methodologies and standards, e.g., GHG protocol. 3. Rigorously collecting and validating data, acknowledging and addressing any uncertainties. 4. Analyzing emission sources to identify key areas for reduction. 5. Developing practical, evidence-based reduction strategies with clear targets and timelines. 6. Communicating findings and recommendations transparently and accurately. 7. Continuously monitoring progress and adapting strategies as needed. Question 14. Research into the potential impacts of a proposed solar farm development on a local wetland ecosystem reveals concerns about energy flow and trophic levels. An environmental professional intern is tasked with assessing how the removal of vegetation for panel installation and the subsequent habitat alteration might affect the energy transfer dynamics within the wetland's food web. Which of the following approaches best demonstrates an understanding of energy flow and its implications for the wetland's trophic structure, as required for a comprehensive environmental impact assessment? Option A. Estimating the energy content of the soil and water within the wetland, and using this as the primary indicator of energy availability for all trophic levels. Option B. Mapping the primary producers and tracing the flow of energy through successive consumer levels, acknowledging the significant energy loss at each transfer and its impact on the biomass and population sizes of higher trophic levels. Option C. Quantifying the total biomass of all observed species within the wetland, and assuming this biomass directly correlates with energy availability at each trophic level. Option D. Focusing solely on the direct impact of vegetation removal on herbivore populations, without considering their predators or the primary producers they consume. The correct answer is C. Quantifying the total biomass of all observed species within the wetland, and assuming this biomass directly correlates with energy availability at each trophic level. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an environmental professional intern to apply fundamental ecological principles to a real-world environmental impact assessment. The challenge lies in accurately identifying and evaluating the flow of energy through different trophic levels within a proposed development's footprint, understanding how disruptions at one level can cascade through the ecosystem. Misinterpreting these relationships can lead to flawed impact assessments, inadequate mitigation strategies, and potential non-compliance with environmental regulations designed to protect ecosystem integrity. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of energy transfer efficiency between trophic levels. Best professional practice dictates that the intern should identify the primary producers, e.g., plants, algae, as the base of the food web, then trace the energy flow to primary consumers, herbivores, secondary consumers, carnivores that eat herbivores, and tertiary consumers, carnivores that eat other carnivores. This requires recognizing that energy is lost at each transfer, typically around 90%, meaning higher trophic levels support fewer organisms and less biomass. This aligns with the principles of ecological assessment mandated by environmental regulations, which require a comprehensive understanding of ecosystem functions to predict and mitigate impacts. Ethically, it demonstrates due diligence and a commitment to scientifically sound environmental stewardship. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the biomass of each trophic level without considering the energy transfer dynamics. This fails to acknowledge the fundamental ecological principle of energy loss, leading to an inaccurate estimation of the ecosystems carrying capacity and resilience. Represents a regulatory failure by not adequately assessing the functional capacity of the ecosystem. Another incorrect approach would be to assume equal energy transfer efficiency between all trophic levels. This fundamentally misunderstands ecological energetics and would lead to gross overestimations of the energy available at higher trophic levels, potentially resulting in the proposal of mitigation measures that are insufficient to support the existing populations. This is an ethical failure due to a lack of professional competence and a regulatory failure in conducting a proper impact assessment. A third incorrect approach would be to only consider the direct impacts on a single trophic level without accounting for its position in the food web and its dependence on lower levels or its role in supporting higher levels. This fragmented view ignores the interconnectedness of the ecosystem and the potential for indirect impacts, which are crucial for a holistic environmental assessment. This constitutes a regulatory failure by not performing a comprehensive ecosystem-level analysis. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such scenarios by first identifying the core ecological principles at play. They must then consider how these principles are addressed within the relevant regulatory framework. The decision-making process involves 1. Clearly defining the scope of the assessment, 2. Gathering relevant ecological data, 3. Applying established scientific methodologies, like understanding trophic dynamics, 4. Evaluating potential impacts against regulatory standards, and 5. Developing appropriate mitigation and monitoring plans. This systematic approach ensures that assessments are scientifically robust, legally compliant, and ethically sound. Question 15. The performance metrics show a consistent decline in local amphibian populations over the past 3 years, a trend that has been flagged by the environmental monitoring team. As an environmental professional intern working on a proposed development project adjacent to a sensitive wetland area, which of the following actions best demonstrates regulatory compliance and professional responsibility regarding biodiversity protection under U.S. federal and state environmental laws? Option A. Recommend a comprehensive ecological impact assessment focused on identifying the specific drivers of amphibian decline and developing targeted mitigation strategies in accordance with the Endangered Species Act and relevant state wildlife regulations. Option B. Suggest relying on historical environmental reports from a decade ago to estimate potential impacts, as current detailed surveys would significantly increase project timelines and expenses. Option C. Advise the project team to proceed with development as planned, assuming the amphibian decline is a natural fluctuation and not directly attributable to the project's potential impacts, to avoid project delays and cost overruns. Option D. Propose a general habitat enhancement program for the wetland area without a detailed assessment of the amphibian population's specific needs or the causes of their decline to fulfill a perceived obligation. The correct answer is A. Recommend a comprehensive ecological impact assessment focused on identifying the specific drivers of amphibian decline and developing targeted mitigation strategies in accordance with the Endangered Species Act and relevant state wildlife regulations. Explanation. The performance metrics show a consistent decline in local amphibian populations over the past 3 years, a trend that has been flagged by the environmental monitoring team. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an environmental professional intern to interpret ecological data within the context of regulatory requirements for biodiversity protection, specifically under the U.S. Endangered Species Act, ESSA, and relevant state-level environmental protection acts. The intern must move beyond simply reporting the data to proposing actionable, compliant strategies. The challenge lies in balancing project development needs with the legal and ethical imperative to conserve biodiversity. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the observed decline by proposing a comprehensive biodiversity assessment and mitigation plan that aligns with the precautionary principle and the spirit of environmental legislation. This involves identifying potential causes of the decline, evaluating impacts on protected species, and developing strategies to avoid, minimize, or compensate for any adverse effects, thereby ensuring compliance with the ESA's prohibitions against take and requirements for habitat protection. This proactive and data-driven approach demonstrates a commitment to ecological stewardship and regulatory adherence. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate project cost reduction by ignoring the biodiversity decline fails to acknowledge the legal obligations under the ESA. This represents a significant regulatory failure, as it risks violating prohibitions against harming or harassing protected species and their habitats. Ethically, it demonstrates a disregard for conservation mandates. Another incorrect approach that proposes generic habitat restoration without a specific assessment of the amphibian decline's causes and the needs of local species is also professionally unacceptable. This approach lacks the specificity required for effective mitigation and may not address the root issues, leading to continued population decline and potential noncompliance. It is a failure to apply due diligence and a lack of understanding of targeted conservation strategies. A third incorrect approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or past project data without current, site-specific ecological surveys is also flawed. This demonstrates a failure to adhere to best practices in environmental assessment and a potential misinterpretation of current ecological conditions, leading to non-compliance and ineffective conservation efforts. Professionals should approach such situations by first thoroughly understanding the relevant regulatory framework, e.g., ESSA, Clean Water Act, state environmental laws. They should then conduct a rigorous site-specific ecological assessment to identify the nature and extent of the biodiversity issue. Based on this assessment, they must develop a mitigation hierarchy, avoid, minimize, restore, offset, that is both ecologically sound and legally compliant. Continuous monitoring and adaptive management are crucial to ensure the effectiveness of mitigation measures. Question 16. System analysis indicates that a proposed industrial development is adjacent to a sensitive wetland ecosystem. As an environmental professional intern, you are tasked with identifying the most critical potential environmental impacts to focus on during the initial stages of the environmental impact assessment. Which of the following approaches best aligns with fundamental concepts of environmental science and regulatory expectations for impact assessment? Option A. Prioritize the assessment of impacts based on the estimated cost of implementing mitigation measures, focusing on those with the lowest mitigation costs to ensure economic feasibility. Option B. Systematically identify all potential direct and indirect impacts on the wetland. Characterize their significance based on ecological principles and regulatory criteria, and prioritize those with the greatest potential for substantial or irreversible harm for detailed analysis and mitigation planning. Option C. Defer the detailed assessment of potential impacts until after the development is operational, allowing for real-world observation of any changes to the wetland. Option D. Focus primarily on impacts that are immediately visible and easily measurable, such as visible water discoloration or obvious habitat destruction, as these are typically the most significant. The correct answer is B. Systematically identify all potential direct and indirect impacts on the wetland. Characterize their significance based on ecological principles and regulatory criteria, and prioritize those with the greatest potential for substantial or irreversible harm for detailed analysis and mitigation planning. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an environmental professional intern to apply fundamental concepts of environmental science within the context of impact assessment, specifically concerning the potential effects of a proposed industrial development on a local wetland ecosystem. The challenge lies in accurately identifying and prioritizing the most significant potential impacts, which necessitates a strong understanding of ecological principles and the regulatory framework governing environmental assessments. Misjudging the significance of impacts can lead to inadequate mitigation measures, non-compliance with environmental regulations, and ultimately, long-term ecological damage. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic and comprehensive evaluation of potential impacts, starting with identifying all plausible direct and indirect effects of the proposed development on the wetland. This includes considering changes in hydrology, water quality, habitat fragmentation, and species displacement. Subsequently, these identified impacts must be characterized in terms of their magnitude, duration, spatial extent, and reversibility. The most significant impacts, those likely to cause substantial or irreversible harm, are then prioritized for detailed analysis and the development of appropriate mitigation and monitoring strategies. This aligns with the principles of environmental impact assessment (IA), as mandated by regulatory frameworks, which require a thorough and objective evaluation of potential environmental consequences to inform decision-making and ensure environmental protection. This systematic process ensures that all relevant factors are considered and that resources are focused on addressing the most critical environmental concerns. Incorrect approach is analysis, focusing solely on readily observable impacts, such as visible pollution, without considering less obvious but potentially more damaging indirect effects like altered groundwater flow or subtle changes in species composition, represents a failure to conduct a comprehensive assessment. This approach is ethically flawed as it risks overlooking significant environmental harm and is regulatorily deficient because it does not meet the thoroughness required by EIA processes. Prioritizing impacts based on the perceived cost of mitigation rather than their ecological significance is another incorrect approach. This is ethically problematic as it places economic considerations above environmental protection, potentially leading to the acceptance of unacceptable environmental degradation. Regulatorily, this violates the principle of avoiding significant adverse environmental effects, as the focus should be on the impact itself, not the cost to mitigate it. Adopting a wait-and-see approach, where impacts are only assessed after the development is operational, is fundamentally contrary to the purpose of impact assessment. This is a severe regulatory failure, as EIA is a predictive tool designed to prevent or minimize harm before it occurs. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for potential environmental damage. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach impact assessment by first understanding the specific regulatory requirements for the jurisdiction, which typically mandate a structured EIA process. This involves defining the project scope, identifying potential impacts through methods like checklists, matrices, and expert judgment, and then characterizing and evaluating the significance of these impacts. The decision-making process should be guided by a hierarchy of controls: avoidance, minimization, restoration, and offsetting. Professionals must maintain objectivity, rely on scientific data and established methodologies, and clearly document their findings and the rationale behind their significance determinations. When faced with uncertainty, a precautionary approach should be adopted, erring on the side of protecting the environment. Question 17. Which approach would be most effective for an environmental professional intern to identify the primary sources and potential effects of a newly discovered contaminant at an active industrial facility, adhering to U.S. environmental regulatory frameworks? Option A. Consult generic pollutant databases for common industrial contaminants and their general effects, without specific reference to the facility's operations. Option B. Focus solely on the facility's most recent discharge permits to identify potential sources, assuming current operations are the only relevant factor. Option C. Prioritize visually obvious potential sources of contamination, such as visible spills or leaks, without conducting a comprehensive review of site history or operational processes. Option D. Systematically investigate on-site historical operational data, process flow diagrams, and chemical inventory records to identify potential sources. Then evaluate the contaminant's physical and chemical properties to predict its environmental fate and transport. The correct answer is D. Systematically investigate on-site historical operational data, process flow diagrams, and chemical inventory records to identify potential sources. Then evaluate the contaminant's physical and chemical properties to predict its environmental fate and transport. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because an environmental professional intern must accurately identify the primary sources and potential effects of a newly discovered contaminant in a complex industrial setting. The intern needs to apply their understanding of environmental science and regulatory frameworks to differentiate between various potential origins and their associated risks, ensuring that remediation efforts are targeted and effective. This requires careful judgment to avoid misallocation of resources or overlooking critical pathways of pollution. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it systematically investigates potential sources based on the site's known industrial activities, and then evaluates the likely environmental fate and transport of the contaminant. This aligns with regulatory requirements for site characterization and risk assessment, which mandate a thorough understanding of pollutant origins and their potential impacts on human health and the environment. By prioritizing on-site historical data and process knowledge, the intern adheres to the principle of investigating the most probable causes first, which is both efficient and compliant with environmental investigation protocols. This methodical approach ensures that regulatory agencies receive accurate information for decision-making and that remedial actions are based on sound scientific evidence, fulfilling ethical obligations to protect the environment. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on generic pollutant databases without considering the specific industrial context of the site is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a lack of site-specific investigation, which is a fundamental requirement under environmental regulations. Such an approach risks misattributing the pollutant to a source unrelated to the site's operations, leading to wasted investigative resources and potentially incorrect remediation strategies. Ethically, it fails to exercise due diligence in protecting the environment and public health by not thoroughly investigating the actual causes of contamination. Another incorrect approach that relies exclusively on the most recent discharge permits without considering historical operations or accidental releases is also professionally flawed. Environmental regulations often require consideration of historical contamination and past operational practices. Focusing only on current permits ignores potential legacy issues or non-compliance events that could be the source of the contaminant. This oversight can lead to incomplete site assessments and ineffective remediation plans, violating the professional duty to conduct comprehensive investigations. Finally, an approach that prioritizes the most visually obvious potential source without a systematic investigation is professionally unsound. Environmental contamination is not always visually apparent, and relying on superficial observations can lead to significant errors in source identification. This approach lacks the scientific rigor demanded by environmental regulations and professional standards, potentially resulting in the failure to identify the true source, and thus failing to adequately address the environmental risk. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the site's history and operational context. This is followed by a systematic evaluation of potential pollutant sources, considering both routine operations and potential non-routine events, e.g., spills, historical practices. The intern should then utilize available data, including historical records, process information, and environmental monitoring data, to prioritize investigations. This structured approach ensures that all relevant factors are considered, leading to accurate source identification and effective environmental protection strategies, in line with regulatory expectations and ethical responsibilities. Question 18. The review process indicates that a proposed development project's environmental impact assessment has identified potential long-term risks associated with climate change, including increased frequency of extreme weather events and rising sea levels, which could disproportionately affect the health and well-being of nearby vulnerable communities and degrade local ecosystems. As an environmental professional intern, you are tasked with providing recommendations for the project's environmental management plan. Which of the following approaches best reflects professional responsibility and ethical practice in this situation? Option A. Omit or significantly downplay the findings related to climate change impacts in the final report to avoid jeopardizing the project's approval and to maintain a positive client relationship, assuming that future adaptation will be handled by others. Option B. Recommend general environmental protection measures that are standard for similar projects, without specifically tailoring them to address the unique, long-term risks posed by climate change to human health and local ecosystems as identified in the assessment. Option C. Prioritize the project's immediate economic viability and regulatory compliance by focusing only on current, demonstrable impacts and deferring any detailed assessment of long-term climate change consequences to future, separate studies. Option D. Fully document and communicate the identified climate change impacts on human health and ecosystems, and propose specific, robust mitigation and adaptation strategies within the environmental management plan to address these projected risks, even if they increase initial project costs. Correct answer is C. Prioritize the project's immediate economic viability and regulatory compliance by focusing only on current, demonstrable impacts and deferring any detailed assessment of long-term climate change consequences to future, separate studies. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge where an environmental professional intern must balance the immediate economic interests of a client with the long-term, potentially severe, and often inequitable impacts of climate change on human health and ecosystems. The intern is tasked with assessing a project's environmental impact, but the data suggests significant climate-related risks that could disproportionately affect vulnerable populations. This requires navigating conflicting priorities and understanding the ethical imperative to consider broader societal well-being beyond project profitability. The intern must exercise sound professional judgment, recognizing that a purely compliance-driven approach may not be sufficient when facing complex, cascading environmental and health risks. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive assessment that explicitly quantifies and communicates the potential impacts of climate change on both ecosystems and human health, even if these impacts extend beyond the immediate project footprint or regulatory compliance thresholds. This aligns with the ethical principles of environmental stewardship and the professional responsibility to protect public health and welfare. By recommending mitigation and adaptation strategies that address these broader risks, the intern demonstrates a commitment to sustainable development and proactive risk management. This approach is best professional practice because it anticipates future challenges, promotes resilience, and upholds the intern's duty to inform stakeholders about potential long-term consequences, thereby fostering more responsible decision-making. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves focusing solely on current regulatory compliance and immediate project impacts, disregarding the projected long-term consequences of climate change on human health and ecosystems. This fails to meet the ethical obligation to consider the broader environmental and public health implications of a project, represents a failure to exercise due diligence in anticipating and mitigating foreseeable risks, potentially leading to future environmental degradation and harm to human populations, particularly vulnerable communities. Another incorrect approach is to downplay or omit the climate change impact assessment findings due to client pressure or a desire to expedite the approval process. This constitutes a serious ethical breach and a failure of professional integrity. It prioritizes short-term economic gains over long-term environmental sustainability and public health, violating the core principles of environmental professionalism. Such an omission can lead to significant unforeseen liabilities and reputational damage for both the intern and the client. A third incorrect approach is to recommend generic mitigation measures without specifically tailoring them to address the identified climate change impacts on human health and ecosystems. While some mitigation is better than none, a failure to specifically address the unique risks identified in the assessment means the project may not be adequately resilient or protective. This approach lacks the depth of analysis required for effective environmental management and fails to adequately safeguard against the specific vulnerabilities highlighted by the climate change projections. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a framework that prioritizes a thorough understanding of potential impacts, including those exacerbated by climate change. This involves proactive identification of risks, comprehensive data analysis, and clear communication of findings to all relevant stakeholders. When faced with conflicting interests, professionals must adhere to ethical codes that emphasize public health, safety, and environmental protection. Decision-making should be guided by a commitment to sustainability, resilience, and the principle of do no harm, even when it requires challenging client expectations or advocating for more robust protective measures. Question 19. The analysis reveals that a proposed infrastructure project is situated adjacent to a critical wetland ecosystem, supporting a diverse array of flora and fauna. While initial species inventories have been conducted, the environmental intern is tasked with evaluating the potential ecological consequences of habitat alteration. Which of the following approaches best addresses the complex community ecology and species interactions that may be impacted by this development? Option A. Conduct a detailed analysis of how the proposed development will alter predator-prey dynamics, competitive interactions among native species, and the stability of symbiotic relationships within the wetland ecosystem, and propose mitigation strategies tailored to these specific interactions. Option B. Assume that standard environmental mitigation practices, such as general habitat restoration, will adequately address any unforeseen impacts on species interactions, without needing to investigate specific ecological relationships. Option C. Focus primarily on identifying and quantifying the populations of any species listed as endangered or threatened within the wetland, assuming other species interactions will remain largely unaffected. Option D. Prioritize the assessment of direct habitat loss for individual species, without delving into the potential indirect effects on their ecological interactions with other organisms in the community. The correct answer is A. Conduct a detailed analysis of how the proposed development will alter predator-prey dynamics, competitive interactions among native species, and the stability of symbiotic relationships within the wetland ecosystem, and propose mitigation strategies tailored to these specific interactions. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the proposed development's impact on a sensitive ecological community requires a nuanced understanding of species interactions. The intern must move beyond simply identifying species to predicting how changes in habitat will alter the delicate balance of predation, competition, and symbiosis, which can have cascading effects on the entire ecosystem. The professional challenge lies in translating ecological theory into actionable impact assessment that is both scientifically sound and compliant with regulatory requirements for environmental protection. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a detailed assessment of how the proposed development will directly and indirectly affect key species interactions. This includes evaluating potential changes in predator-prey dynamics, e.g., habitat fragmentation reducing prey availability for a keystone predator, competitive exclusion, e.g., introduction of invasive species outcompeting native flora, and symbiotic relationships, e.g., disruption of pollination networks or mycorrhizal associations. This approach is best professional practice because it aligns with the precautionary principle often embedded in environmental regulations, which mandates proactive identification and mitigation of potential harm. It demonstrates a commitment to understanding the complex ecological web, rather than a superficial overview, ensuring that the impact assessment is thorough and leads to effective mitigation strategies that protect biodiversity and ecosystem function as required by environmental protection laws. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the presence or absence of individual species without considering their ecological roles and interactions. This fails to meet regulatory requirements for a comprehensive impact assessment, as it ignores the interconnectedness of the ecosystem. Ethically, it represents a failure to adequately protect biodiversity by overlooking indirect impacts that can lead to species decline or local extinction. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that any species interaction not explicitly listed as endangered or threatened will remain unaffected. This is a flawed assumption that disregards the potential for subtle but significant shifts in community structure due to habitat alteration. Regulatory failure occurs because impact assessments must consider cumulative and indirect effects, not just direct impacts on listed species. Ethically, it is irresponsible to ignore potential harm to non-listed species that may be crucial to ecosystem health. Third incorrect approach would be to rely on generic mitigation measures without a specific understanding of the local species interactions. While general conservation practices are important, they may not address the unique vulnerabilities of the community in question. This approach is professionally deficient because it lacks the specificity required for effective environmental management and may not satisfy regulatory mandates for tailored mitigation plans. Ethically, it suggests a lack of diligence in understanding the specific ecological context. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach this situation by first identifying the key species within the affected community and understanding their trophic levels and interdependencies. This involves reviewing existing ecological data, conducting field surveys if necessary, and consulting with subject matter experts. The next step is to analyze the proposed development's potential impacts on these interactions, considering direct habitat loss, fragmentation, introduction of stressors e.g., noise, pollution, and potential for invasive species introduction. Based on this analysis, a robust impact assessment can be developed, outlining potential negative consequences and proposing specific, science-based mitigation and monitoring strategies. This systematic process ensures compliance with regulatory frameworks and upholds ethical responsibilities to environmental stewardship. Question 20. Compliance review shows that a farm operation is experiencing significant topsoil erosion due to inadequate vegetative cover and improper tillage practices on sloped fields. The jurisdiction's Soil Conservation and Management Act mandates the implementation of practices to prevent soil loss exceeding a specified threshold. Which of the following actions best addresses the identified noncompliance in accordance with the Act? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive biodiversity assessment to identify opportunities for habitat restoration across the farm. Option B. Invest in advanced irrigation systems to improve soil moisture retention and reduce the need for frequent tilling. Option C. Focus on reducing the overall acreage under cultivation to minimize the area exposed to erosion risks. Option D. Implement a cover cropping program on all sloped fields during off-seasons and transition to conservation tillage methods for all planting activities. The correct answer is D. Implement a cover cropping program on all sloped fields during off-seasons and transition to conservation tillage methods for all planting activities. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an environmental professional intern to interpret and apply specific soil conservation and management regulations within a defined jurisdiction, ensuring that proposed actions align with legal requirements and best practices. The intern must demonstrate an understanding of the nuances of these regulations, not just a superficial knowledge. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the identified noncompliance by proposing actions that are explicitly mandated or strongly encouraged by the relevant soil conservation and management regulations. This approach prioritizes adherence to legal frameworks, which is a fundamental ethical and professional obligation for any environmental professional. It demonstrates a commitment to rectifying the situation in a manner that is both legally sound and environmentally responsible, safeguarding the land from further degradation and promoting sustainable practices as intended by the regulations. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate cost reduction without considering regulatory mandates fails to acknowledge the legal obligations. This is a significant regulatory failure, as environmental regulations are not optional suggestions but enforceable requirements. Ethically, it prioritizes financial expediency over environmental protection and legal compliance, which is unprofessional. Another incorrect approach that suggests implementing practices not directly related to the identified soil erosion issues, even if they are generally considered good environmental practices, is also problematic. While well-intentioned, it fails to address the specific noncompliance identified in the review. This represents a failure to accurately diagnose and treat the problem according to the regulatory framework. It may also indicate a lack of understanding of the specific requirements for soil conservation and management in this context, leading to inefficient or misdirected efforts. A professional decision-making process for similar situations involves a systematic approach. 1. Thoroughly understand the specific regulatory requirements applicable to the situation. 2. Accurately assess the identified noncompliance against these regulations. 3. Identify and evaluate potential corrective actions, prioritizing those that directly address the noncompliance and align with regulatory mandates. 4. Consider the feasibility, effectiveness, and long-term sustainability of proposed solutions. 5. Document all findings, decisions, and actions taken, ensuring transparency and accountability. 6. Seek guidance from senior professionals or regulatory bodies when uncertainties arise.